Scholars agree that the scroll of Job is late archaic writing of the ancient Hebrew, meaning it was not exilic work when the Hebrew lexicon changed during the Babylonian captivity. It has strong elements of Aramaic in it, because indeed Job was an Aramean Edomite. The work is undeniably written before 586 BC, so let us not be confused that Job is post-exilic. If it is pre-exilic, which most people would now agree, the next question arises, but how many years, to be exact? Jacob, the fraternal twin brother of Esau, was described as an Aramean in Deuteronomy 26, verse 5. A wandering Aramean was my father, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there. Josh McDowell has said Aramaic has perhaps the longest continuous living history of any language known. If Jacob is described as an Aramean, his brother Esau would also be an Aramean. With the book of Job, we see that the prologue and epilogue were most likely the original accounts of Job that was in the custody of the Jews written on vellum parchment scrolls. Where Solomon comes into the picture is he would have written his part to the story, adding to the poetics. Solomon would have had the Edomite King's list and official records in Genesis 25 and 36 to evaluate his rendering, including any writings that Moses fashioned. Moreover, a contender of Solomon was a man named Hadad, who was the last of the Edomite royal line. Then the Lord raised up against Solomon an adversary, Hadad the Edomite, from the royal line of Edom, 1 Kings 11:14. This unique passage may interlope with a man named Hadad, who is listed last in the Edomite King's list found in Genesis 36. The only minor discrepancy is if both of these Hadads are the same Hadad in a chronological timeline, considering Genesis was written during the time of Moses, and the Book of Kings was written post-exilic after the Babylonian captivity, meaning much of what was written was taken from the Samuel account, and the prophets from descending order, so these two Hadads may not overlap. However, when you review the Edomite Kings list, you notice it may have been a later addition, and not Mosaic when examined. Scholars point to Jeremiah's authorship of Kings around 570 to 540 BC, but we know that Hadad is recorded in the Book of Kings as an opposer to Solomon around the time of 1000 BC to 950 BC. There seems to be a match. Possible writers of the first account. The only possible writers of Job would have been Job himself, Elihu, who would have been a witness to Job's suffering event, Jethro, who lived in the vicinity of the land of Uz, or Moses, who lived in Midian and communicated with the Lord in Arabia, at Mount Sinai. Bildad is not a possible candidate. Perhaps Eliphaz is an outside chance, but the evidence does not lead toward him neither. Zophar does not fit the bill either. In many ways, Bildad and Zophar are tertiary characters in the story, but obviously they would have also been witnesses to the events of Job, but not writers of the account on sheepskins. Bildad's name is an interesting study because it means Lord of Hadad, and Hadad means to shout. Hadad is a common name in Edomite lore. The first Hadad named in the Bible is Ishmael's son in Genesis 25, who comes before Bildad. Hadad, son of Bildad, Hadad the Edomite, or Ben-Hadad in the Old Testament. We can see the name Hadad was originally an Egyptian name, considering Ishmael was half Egyptian and half Aramean. His wife was an Egyptian. It is so fitting because Hadad the Edomite lived in Egypt for a time period, 1 Kings 11, 17, 21. Genesis 25, 12 through 8. These are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar, the Egyptian, Sarah's servant, bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael, named in the order of their birth: Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, and Kedar, Adbeel, Bibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedema. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names, by their villages and by their encampments, 12 princes according to their tribes. These are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. He breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people. They settled from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt in the direction of Assyria. He settled over against all his kinsmen. Here's the driving point. The Job account was not an oral tradition. Evidence leads to the reality that there was a written Job account sometime after Job's life. Think of it like this. If Job lived 210 years, and his trial occurred at age 70, there would have been 140 years to write the events of his life on vellum parchment. Think hard on this. There was 140 years within the lifespan of Job to write his account. The general consensus for scholars is that Solomon indeed wrote the poetics of the book from an original source. The original source was an Aramaic version in the custody of the Jews since the time of Moses. One must remember that Canaanite Hebrew, similar to Aramaic, was the lingua franca of the Exodus Israelites, and not the kind of Hebrew they spoke after the Babylonian captivity. Solomon spoke the Aramaic version of Hebrew. After all, there is an episode in 2 Kings 18:26 stating, "Then Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, along with Shebna and Joah, said to the Rabshakeh, 'Please speak to your servants in Aramaic, since we understand it. Do not speak with us in Hebrew in the hearing of the people on the wall.'" The Jews were fluent in Aramaic. It was a language cognate of Hebrew. Interestingly, Moabite, Phoenician script, Proto-Hebrew, and Aramaic were language cognates for which those people could intelligibly communicate with one another. They were of the same language family. To this day, there are Syrians that can speak ancient Aramaic, Syriac, the tongue of Job. Aramaic is not a dead language, it's a living language, people who speak it intelligibly to this present hour. The Aramaic connection with Job and Yahwism is an Edomite genesis. It is because the story of Job takes place in that specific window of time. Furthermore, Job was a Yahwist amid polytheistic religious practices surrounding him. We see that the Edomites initially practiced Yahwism before they digressed into Baal worship. Secular historian K. van der Toorn concludes, by the 14th century BC, before the cult of Yahweh had reached Israel, groups of Edomites and Midianites worshipped Yahweh as their god. Van der Toorn called it a cult, but we Christians and Jews know that Yahweh is the only God in the world, and there are no other gods. Exodus 23, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." Furthermore, Job's name was not pronounced with a J, but a Y, so it would have sounded like Yob, like Jethro, the priest of Midian. Job was the priest of his city. So it was when the days of feasting had run their course that Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. Job 1, 5-7. Job was performing the priestly service before the Aaronic priesthood was instituted. He was a believer in Yahweh from Arabia. Could it be that God is from Arabia? Are the Muslims right? Jethro was a Yahwist. Furthermore, Jethro was also called Reuel, meaning he was a descendant of the clan of Reuel, who was the son of Esau, Genesis 36:10. When closely studying Jethro, we see that he's a relative of Job in the family line of Reuel. By happenstance, Moses had married into the family line of Reuel, a remnant of Yahweh worshippers. Jethro was the priest of Midian, meaning he was ordained for the worship of Yahweh. Isn't it so interesting that somehow Moses marries a distant relative, Zipporah, on Esau's family tree? Did you catch that? Scripture says Job had 3,000 camels, and everyone knows Arabia and the camel are synonymous with the Araba desert. Job 1:2. The book of Job is an Arabian tale, not in a sense referring to ethnic Arabs, but of Arabian desert dwellers from the line of Esau, Aramean Edomites, who later were defined in the time of the Romans as Idumeans. In the Russian Eastern Orthodox lore, Job is an Edomite who is married to an Arab woman from the family line of Ishmael. There may not have been a city associated with Job, considering he was a pastoralist shepherd, Arabian-dwelling nomad. Jacob was a contemporary of Job, and Jacob was a shepherd, a herdsman, who was a sojourner. Pharaoh asked the brothers, "What is your occupation?" "Your servants are shepherds," they replied to Pharaoh, "just as our fathers were." Genesis 47:3. While the kingdoms of Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon were formidable empires during Job's life, he was also attacked by Babylonians, Chaldeans from the east, and Sabians from the south. Raiding was a common practice in Arabia. Undoubtedly Basra, Petra, and Teman were formidable cities during the time of Job. Perhaps Job could have lived in one of these locations. We're not 100% to be sure. The Edomites lived in the clefts of the rocks in Petra, but they also had vast grazing lands. We know for sure that Edom's government developed far before Israel's occupation of Canaan. The Israelites were sojourners and slaves under the Egyptians, heavy hand for 215 years, until their exodus in 1491 BC. When we see the Lord say, "You shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother. You shall not abhor an Egyptian, because you were a sojourner in his land." Deuteronomy 23:7. I have given Esau the hill country of Seir as his own. Deuteronomy 2:5. One must remember that Esau was the favorite son of Isaac, and not his younger brother Jacob. Isaac loved Edom, Esau more than Israel, Jacob. Genesis 25:28. Hebrews 11:20 states, by faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. Esau is not out of the picture. Spiritual blessings were placed on Esau's family lineage. The bigger picture is that prophecies of old will happen in Edom. The Edomite Kings list in Genesis 36 shows that the Edomites had at least 8 kings before the Israelite monarchy in 1040 BC. Job was one of these kings. The greatest man from the east does not mean how great of a guy Job was, but that he was a great king of Uz, who was its ruler at the time or one of the co-regent rulers of Edom. Solomon expounds on what happened to Job by writing about how Job got raided. Job got raided. His land was robbed, his property stolen, his children killed, his livestock plundered. It was ancient theft.